that there was a compensation supplement, and it was kind of a joint effort between the state and localities, that if we put in a certain amount for compensation, we would be eligible to receive the compensation supplement. Unfortunately, that is right now being unallotted. And then the Virginia Preschool Initiative increases that were put in place will revert back right now to last year's level of funding. So there won't be any additional there. But the big story in all of this is the vast majority of the funding for rebenchmarking remains in the budget. So what we'll share with you tonight is that our state aid, and I'm not talking about sales tax, just state aid, is going to decrease by about $22,187, which is a really great news for us as a school division. So speaking of sales tax, which is the other part of money that we get from the state, the governor has now, as everybody I think is aware, frozen all new expenditures included in that state aid. There has not been an updated forecast for sales tax to 2021, but we anticipate one shortly because they're getting ready to start the new general session, or that they're calling the general session back in tomorrow. But the state's original budgeted projection for sales tax would have resulted in an 8.8% increase to us. We don't anticipate that. So for planning purposes, we are considering a 10% decrease as opposed to an 8.8% increase. The next is about federal stimulus funding. And again, this is not a good news story for the City of Falls Church. I think everybody knows, there was a $2 trillion CARES funding package, which is the Corona Aid Relief and Economic Security Act. And that would provide $13.5 billion for public schools. And those schools were schools identified that had at least 90% of the aid of that money was earmarked for Title I. We have a very small number of students that qualify for Title I, which means that they qualify for free and reduced lunch. And because that is the methodology for distribution of the federal stimulus dollars, what we thought was going to be $45,000 is actually $33,000. So we are getting the lowest allocation in the state due to our size and the amount of poverty. Just an example of a comparative analysis, Fairfax City, which has a slightly larger system, not that much more, is getting $231,000, and that's because of the relative poverty in their system. This money also would be considered that one-time funding that I had mentioned previously, and so because it's one-time funding, we wouldn't want to use that for any kind of operating dollars either. So the next slide really gives the updated revenue projections as sort of indicated in what I just talked about. And in the end, our FY21 revenues are projected to be $2.4 million lower than the advertised budget. So you remember the advertised budget was $52,300,000, and that was, I'm sorry, yes, it was more than that. That was the approved budget, and then plus 2.4 million. So anyway, in the end, we have to make some adjustments to be able to compensate for that gap. So some of the expenditure adjustments that we are making are some things that I think you can imagine that I've mentioned to the staff already. But I do want to take just a second to say this was really, and I said it out loud, and maybe that was something that I'll regret, but it really at one point was perhaps the most promising budget I'd ever experienced as a school superintendent. And that budget has really been derailed by this global pandemic. And we are not alone. And I want to make sure everybody understands that every regional colleague I've spoken to is experiencing something very similar to what we're experiencing. And no one I've spoken to is able to do any kind of additional things in their system. So as a consequence of that, the things we are going to have to look at we're not going to be able to offer our step increase to our staff this year, or a cost of living adjustment, or proceed with any of the investments towards our goals. And that is incredibly painful. And I just want to share with the board, one of the things we've talked about during this pandemic has been who has carried the day for the City of Falls Church. And in the end, it's really been the staff and the faculty in our buildings and across the system. And to think that we're not able to give them any kind of compensation adjustments, really hard to think about. But we do have a strategy going forward. But I feel really terrible about that, and wish that we were in a different place. The good news, if there is good news, is that because of the additional revenue that we're receiving from the state, we aren't going to have to make any more deep cuts or more painful structural cuts that would be really difficult to recover from. And an example of some of those painful cuts that we might be up against if we were in a worst case scenario situation would be things like raising class size. And once you raise class size, it's really hard to put in the budget more teachers the following year or the next year or 2 years later. Those things just are hard to get back. So right now, what we've prepared for you as a 21 budget really is keeping things exactly as they are now. So one of the ways that I've talked about it with the community has been, we sort of pressed pause on March 13th. We went forward with our online learning, but in the fall, when hopefully we can all get back together, we will pick up right where we left off. So in the next slide, you'll see the updated expenditures. And here you'll see how we're planning to balance the budget. So when you take out the step, the cost of living adjustment, we still have three things in there that are mandatory. Just as a reminder to everybody, we do have to pay the employer portion of the health increases. We had budgeted $321,000. The actual cost and adjustment for that is slightly better than we anticipated, which is good. But we also still have to pay the Virginia Retirement System amount, and we have to pay the VRS life insurance portion as well. The other things you'll see that are coming out of the budget that once was the really great budget is the IB/MYP coordinator, the pre-K-12 English language arts coordinator, social worker, contract length adjustment, the office support, JTP clinic, and custodial support. So how are we going to fix all that is through looking at, in addition to those, we are going to look at salary lapse. We're going to look at other employee benefits, and then look at some savings through the city retirement system. So in summary, we do again have an agreement, if you will, from the general government that they will, with us, continue to review revenues quarterly. And if indeed there is some money at the end of the quarter or the end of the second quarter, at whatever point in time that comes to the school system, one of the things that I would like to do is have a conversation at that point about the board to revisit what our priorities were. And I think it was fairly clear from the beginning that our priorities were around compensation. So as extra revenue comes in, I'd like to come back and talk with all of you about modifying compensation. And that can really happen at any point during the year. So all of that to say that we could do, if revenues improved, we could do a COLA at mid-year. We could even potentially do a step at mid-year. It just depends on what the numbers look like. So based on this revenue projection and the additional 37 students that we're looking at receiving, you get a sense for kind of where we are with the reduction. So that takes us then to the third portion of the presentation tonight, and then I'll take questions, and Kristen and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, is the budget calendar. And the City Council has revised their budget calendar, and they intend to do first reading of the budget on April 27th. The City Council will then have a work session on the 11th and adopt the budget on May 26th, which then puts in play our calendar. And our calendar, you got the budget update. We're doing the budget work session tonight. And then on May 12th, we would come back and do another budget work session and a public hearing. And at that point, we should have a pretty good sense of where we are revenue and expenditure wise. And then we would ask that the school board consider coming back on May 28th and have a special meeting that doesn't take the place of the other two meetings, but do a special meeting immediately following the City Council's meeting, so we could do final adoption of the budget. If there was a need to push that into June, we would be happy to also accommodate that. The only thing about doing it in May is it gives us a little bit more time to load the budget into the system. And again, if there are changes that need to be made, gives us an opportunity to do that. So that's a lot of information thrown at you. And I think that we're, if there is a worse place to be, and there is a worse place to be, I would say we're probably in as good a situation as we can be right now. And I think that knowing that the re-benchmarking was kept in the state budget really has been in many ways a lifesaver to the school system, insofar as we can continue to operate with the staff that we have now and be good team players with the city government and the general government. So we will take our cuts, but we can kind of have it both ways, and that's very lucky for us, I think. So with that, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair, I will turn it back, and if there are questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Noonan, and thank you, Ms. Michael, for a very detailed presentation. I'll be looking for questions from the board at this point. If Ms. Downs.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Noonan, and thank you, Ms. Michael. I have 3 questions. The first one has to do with the current fiscal year. And, you know, I understand that using the fund balance is something that we can do if we need to. I was wondering, at our last, I think it was our last face-to-face meeting, we approved a number of one-time expenses. So I can't remember all, but it was Jesse Thackeray supplies. I remember that it was terrace furniture from Mount Daniel. I didn't know if that was something that was still in play or if those funds are gone. So I was just wondering if you know, if that would prevent from having to dip back into the fund balance if we needed it.
It's a great question. We did, you all did approve some expenditures, and some of that was out of that transfer that we received from the FY19 budget from the general government. So in addition to the things you've mentioned, it was also the security vestibule at Mary Ellen Henderson. We've gone forward with many of those projects, but at this point, if it wasn't already approved, we are holding those until we have a better understanding of where we completely stand.
Thank you. 2 questions about the fiscal year 2020 budget. Before COVID hit, we had a number of staff notify us that they were not going to be returning in the fall. I'm particularly thinking of a couple college counseling positions and counseling positions at Mason. So I guess I'm asking, are you all going to do a look at what these open positions are? Are we automatically going to be refilling them, or you're just going to see where we are?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have had that conversation with principals, and we are scrutinizing every position right now. Again, if there is good news right now, by taking the $500,000 reduction and looking at sort of the moderate scenario that has been shared with us, it wouldn't be any reduction in current levels of staffing. So that example, which is a good one, the college career counselor, we are going to go ahead and fill that position. We're also going to fill the assistant principal position that's vacant at the high school as well, because those are core functions that we really feel like we need to move forward with.
I was hoping you were going to say that. Thank you. And then my final question, in the presentation, you noted that we're projecting an enrollment increase of 37 students, but I know that we also had I think that was before COVID, we were projecting that. And I know we've had a bump with State Department families coming as a result of COVID. So could it possibly be even more than 37 students?
It is possible. We are tracking that as closely as we can. We've had a couple of students that have left the system also. So there's sort of this in and out that's going on through this COVID-19. But we are tracking it, and we could end up with more State Department kids than we anticipated. And if that happens, we'll have to figure out how to adapt.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ms. Downs. I saw Mr. Webb had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Noonan, I just wanted to bring up a question that came up last night, and just so that the public can know as well. Of the jurisdictions around us.